think back to what we did in school last week and have a look at these images to suggest why the Sahel is vulnerable to drought and how do human activities make this worse. So in case you didn't know, the Sahel is this band between the Sahara Desert and the tropical areas below. If you have a look at your global atmospheric circulation, you can see that it sits between that subtropical high and that tropical low, and it is an area that is affected by the wet season known as the monsoon. So in the Northern Hemisphere summer, the rain, the ITCZ, that band of thunderstorms pushes northwards, brings the wet season to the Sahel in the summer. Then in the winter, the rain pushes southwards. So it has two distinct seasons, a dry season and a wet season, which is determined by our global atmospheric circulation and our annual wet season. So how do human activities make this worse? If you couldn't think of any, then don't worry too much. We'll cover them as we go through the lesson. So it's looking at things like overgrazing, deforestation, over-abstraction of groundwater, that kind of thing. So this lesson is all about human contribution to drought and resilience of different ecosystems. So ultimately, we need to look at what people are doing to make drought worse, apply the named examples, then look at the impact it's having on wetlands and rainforests, so forested areas, and then we'll evaluate how resilient these different areas actually are. So we have got a named case study. We're going to use the Sahel as our named case study, but we are going to use Brazil as an example to combine wetlands and forest stress when looking at resilience. So we're still in deficits within the hydrological cycle using our named example. So human activity then, like I said before, we can over-abstract water. So we can take too much from surface water, like rivers, or we can take too much from groundwater, so underground stores of water known as aquifers. And we've directly affected this by literally, physically taking the water out of them, or by pumping water up from the groundwater. But we can also restrict the movement of water downstream by building things like dams that create reservoirs and store the water, but also by water transfers, so moving water from one area to another. Humans have indirectly affected it by affecting the land use. So we've studied how processes such as interception, evapotranspiration occur to sustain the global hydrological cycle. If you change that land use, you alter those processes. So for example, deforestation and overgrazing reduce the amount of vegetation. That reduces the amount of evapotranspiration that takes place, so water going back from the vegetation into the atmosphere, that then creates more water. So you get a reduction in atmospheric moisture, and the knock-on effect is a reduction in precipitation. If you've got plants, they catch the water, it then goes back into the atmosphere. If you haven't got plants, the water goes into the river and it leaves the system. So you've got no more water to actually create more rainfall. So that's why forests and things act as like a positive feedback mechanism. They maintain the system in a balance and an equilibrium. If you remove vegetation, you can also change the soil conditions. So what can happen is the soil can become compacted, you get less organic matter, and it's the organic matter that actually stores the moisture. You do all of this, you get less infiltration, so you've got less water soaking in, you've got more running across the surface. As a result, you've got less water stored in the soil, but also further down. If you combine that with climate change, and we're going to look at climate change in more detail in September, that makes this whole situation a little bit more uncertain. But we do think that human actions, so anthropogenic climate change, do make drought even more of a problem, but we'll look at that in more detail later. So all I want you to do is I want you to explain the difference between direct and indirect impact on drought from human activities, and then explain how land use change actually increases the drought risk. So you've got a little diagram here, you can draw that, you can print it, but I want you to summarise what I've just talked you through, please. Now we'll look at the Sahel. So the Sahel has high variability of rainfall at all scales. So from 1 year to seasons within the year, but it could be longer and it could be over like a decade. So a decade is obviously 10 years. So like I said at the start of the lesson, the Sahel is this transition climate zone. 85% of its rainfall falls in the summer when it has its wet season, when you get the ITCZ, so the low pressure, pushing northwards, bringing the rain. So during that wet season, you can get about 800 millimetres of rain along the southern edge where the rain is, and it can be down to 100 millimetres, so a very arid climate on the edge of the Sahara, so to the north of the Sahel. So that's within a year. Annually, so from year to year, the edge where the Sahel joins the Sahara, you can see quite a large variability in the amount of rainfall, and that's because it's affected by the temperature of the oceans. If your sea surface temperatures in the tropics are very warm, they can cause more convection, so more evaporation, air to rise, causing rainfall. This can then affect the monsoon, so it can stop the monsoon arriving and cause the drought in the Sahel. And then this graph here, this shows you the average rainfall amounts that have fallen in the Sahel. So the blue is above average. The average is based on a 30-year average. The red is way because it's been below. So since 1970, the Sahel has had significantly below average rainfall. Bit of a problem. So when we look at those human factors, they don't cause the drought, but what they can do is they can make the drought worse. And that's what happened in the Sahel. So specifically Ethiopia and Eritrea, the 10 million people needed food assistance because there was a famine from the drought. And the drought impacts were increased because of the socioeconomic conditions. So that's the conditions that the people were living in and their level of economic development. So what you had is the environment was being degraded, it was being damaged because you had too much overgrazing. You had people chopping down wood for fuel wood, and you had high levels of poverty. They also had a huge increase in population, so you're talking a doubling every 20 to 30 years, and that meant you had too many people and not enough food. The food that they did have, so the agriculture was fed by the rain. So if the rain season failed, that meant the droughts caused a fail of crops, which meant there was no food. Because you got more people, you also ended up with overcultivation, so people trying to grow too much. To make that even worse, Ethiopia and Eritrea were at war, so the aid that was sent in didn't always help the people that actually needed it. So what you can see here is this is a diagram that shows you how complicated, I suppose, that process of desertification is. So you can draw your own version of it, or you can print it out and glue it in. You just need to know what this process of desertification is and what causes it. So let's have a read through this information here. I'll put it on Show My Homework as well. And I want to answer these 3 questions. So what is the Sahel and why is it vulnerable to drought? How have human impacts affected the drought risk? So it made it worse. And finally, what is desertification? How is it caused? And how can human activities make it worse? So you can use all the information I've given you so far. You can use the information you've got here to answer those 3 questions, please. Now we'll look at ecosystems, so looking at wetlands to start off with. And what a wetland is, it's an area of marsh, fen, peatland or water. It can be natural, it can be artificial, it might be permanent or it might be temporary, so it might only have water on it for certain times of the year. It can be static, so not moving, or it can be flowing. It can be fresh water, it can be brackish water, or it can be salt water. And they're important because these wetlands have certain functions. So biological, that means that the living organisms within it can actually break down pollutants, contaminants. Chemical, so it can literally absorb chemicals, change the chemical composition, act as like a cleaner, I suppose, for the water. And it also functions physically. So that's things like storing water, preventing flood risk, slowing down the movement of water to prevent the flood risk. All of this is dependent on supplies of water, so these wetlands are actually very, very vulnerable to drought. So you can have a read through this information here and have a look through the diagram. This section talks to you about forest stress, so again, have a read through the information. And then once you've read both bits of information, on wetland ecosystems and then forest ecosystems. I want you to answer these questions. So which, in your opinion, which ecosystem is the most resilient to drought? So resilient means it can bounce back, it can cope with it, it can come back. And I want you to explain your decision, but I want you to explain your decision based on this information, based on some specific examples. Now we're going to apply all of that to Brazil. So you're going to build up a profile of what's happened. You need to cover the causes and the impacts of the drought in Brazil. What positive feedback the rainforest actually provides, and I've given you a diagram here to show you, and you've got some diagrams up here that you can use. I've given you some key terms here to help you understand what I mean by some of these words. You then need to include how human activities make it worse. What was the impact on the rainforest? What was the impact on the wetlands? So obviously the rainforest is in Brazil. The wetland we're talking about is an area called the Pantanal, which is a huge wetland area in parts of Brazil as well. So you can use my template, draw it out, print it, it's entirely up to you. And I then want you to use this information here to help you populate your table. It's not about having masses and masses of information, it's about understanding how that information connects with each other, because then at the bottom you're going to make some judgments. Do human actions have a greater impact than natural causes? So the drought in Brazil. And is the rainforest more resilient than the wetlands? So once you've populated the key facts in these boxes, that's what I want you to answer, please. Okay, 2 bits to go, bit of a jog your memory. I want you to write down the answers to these 4 questions. I'm then going to give you the answers and I want you to mark them, be honest. So number 1, how does drought affect a wetland ecosystem? What type of ecosystem is most resilient to drought? What is meant by the term ecosystem functioning? What does carbon sequestration mean in relation to a woodland ecosystem? So your answers, number 1, it can increase tree mortality, so kill trees, reduce their habitats and contribute to wildfires. Arid or semi-arid, such as the Sahel, that tends to be the most vulnerable. Biological, chemical and physical processes that take place within the ecosystem, that's what we mean by ecosystem functioning. And 4, CO2 is removed from the atmosphere and it is stored. Right, exam question relating to what I've just talked to you about. Using examples, assess ways in which deficits within the hydrological system can have significant impacts. So I want you to plan it using this grid, go through the thought process, use what we've gone through today. If you need any help with it, leave me a comment and show my homework, and if necessary, I can do your talk through again. So that's it for today. I'll see you in school on Friday. No, I won't. I'll see you in school next week.